tardes, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos. Vamos a dar inicio a esta conferencia sobre el multilateralismo hoy y cómo un análisis desde las prácticas nos permite entender mejor el funcionamiento de la toma de decisiones en este nivel. Y para esto tenemos como invitado al Dr. Vincent Pouliot de la Universidad de McGill en Canadá. Es profesor en el Departamento de Ciencia Política con especialización en Relaciones Internacionales de esta universidad. Y antes de esto, él realizó un doctorado en la misma disciplina con la misma especialización en la Universidad de Toronto. En su trabajo académico destaca por dos aspectos fundamentales, como el tema de la conferencia de hoy sobre una nueva propuesta analítica para entender mejor cómo funcionan las instituciones internacionales a partir de la noción de prácticas y además asocia este análisis con una herramienta, una técnica metodológica que nos viene de la sociología, que son los análisis de correspondencias múltiples, ¿no? Pero hoy lo vamos a escuchar sobre todo sobre las conclusiones de su estudio del multilateralismo. Entonces, sin más, le paso la palabra. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for being here. Many thanks for the invitation as well. Elodie has been a fantastic host, Jean-François, the director of the center. And thanks to all of you for making time and being here. I'm delighted to address Colegio de Mexico and to be in Mexico. It's my first time and I've enjoyed every minute so far. And so it's been absolutely wonderful. I have to apologize. I'm going to deliver my speech in English. English is not my mother tongue either. So in a way, we're all equal. My Spanish is at the beginner's level. And so I don't think I could make it in Spanish. So please bear with me. And I appreciate your understanding on this. The talk that I'm going to give today is based on recent research of mine. But I really want to acknowledge as well my collaboration with a professor at the Université de Montréal who's named Jean-Philippe Terrien and who clearly has contributed substantively to some of the insights that I'm going to present. And so definitely he's been a very, very important, not only a very good friend, but also a very important source of inspiration. Essentially, what I want to provide you today is a different take on global governance. Especially the recent evolutions and future prospects. I'm not going to make predictions, of course. I don't think that's necessarily the purpose of social science, but I think we can see some trends emerging. And sometimes those trends speak to at least short-term, medium-term future. And I really want to sort of shift a little bit our gaze and try to take a different look at global governance. And the reason for this is when we think about global governance, and especially multilateralism and the so-called crisis of multilateralism, I think that that's the word that's on the lips of everybody today, the crisis of multilateralism. What we think about are usually the same kinds of images. And hopefully what I'm going to show you are things that also you can turn on your mind. For instance, we think about Donald Trump. This is at the NATO summit, and the rise of other populist or very deeply skeptical governments of multilateralism. We also think of failures of multilateralism. This is COP25, the Conference of Parties, just last December, which, has, failure is perhaps too strong of a word, but clearly is being challenged in addressing climate change, and increasingly so to a certain extent. And I could have talked about terrorism, migrations. We are facing a number of issues today that are defying existing institutions. And then we also I think as well of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the deadlock in multilateral trade regime and its replacement with bilateral treaties and sometimes more nationalistic or protectionist measures. So those are, I think, the kinds of images that we all think about, myself included, when we think about the current state of multilateralism. These things are all critically important, okay? Don't get me wrong. They receive a lot of coverage, both in the media and in the scholarly world. And all of this is for very good reasons. That's because they matter a lot. At the same time, though, I think that there's a lot of stuff going on that doesn't make the headlines, but that's also highly significant if we want to make sense of what's going on today in multilateralism and global governance. And so what I really want to do today is try to take you beyond the headlines, okay? And look at changes in multilateralism, in global governance, that won't make the cut, okay, that won't be talked about, debated publicly in the public sphere, but as I will argue, that are nonetheless very significant if we want to capture and grasp where the world is headed. So essentially, the claim that I want to make today is that multilateralism is transforming through a set of low-key, small-scale, mostly informal and incremental changes. And that these, of course, are much harder to see, but once we start to study them properly and pay attention, I believe, we also see the significance of these changes, especially in political terms, right? They're transforming the political stage. So I'm going to first make the argument in broader terms, and then I'm going to walk you through two, if I have enough time, three more specific cases that I've been researching recently. One is the transformation in the selection process of the United Nations Secretary General, which happened a couple of years ago when Antonio Guterres was nominated in 2016. I also want to talk about transformations in the ways in which the Security Council, again at the United Nations, all my examples are from the United Nations, that's what I specialize on, how the working methods and the ways in which the Security Council conducts its everyday businesses has been transforming. And again, this is a completely untold story, but it's a story that matters a lot if we want to understand the global governance of security. And time allowing, or during the Q&A, the question and answer period, I also have some materials about the making of the Sustainable Development Goals, if you're interested, a few years ago. All right, let me start with a thought experiment, okay? Let's imagine for a minute that a team, a transnational team, for the sake of my experiment, a team of physicists and engineers came to invent a functioning geoengineering device, which would allow us, amongst other things, to transform the planet on a large scale in order to fight climate change, for instance, and of course it would probably be tooled towards other purposes. I think we could all relatively easily envision what would ensue from such a revolutionary technological development as far as multilateralism and global governance are concerned. Rapidly, some capital funds and cutting-edge startups would rush to invest, take control of the technology, and then in response, a group of leading nations would probably confer, likely in an informal summit, to coordinate their position on this new development. The United Nations Secretary General would set up a panel of experts to come up with analysis and policy recommendations about this new development. Non-state actors would no doubt get involved too. Corporations, multinational corporations would form probably some form of network to lobby for friendly domestic regulations, ask the World Trade Organization for continuation of free trade. Coalitions of human rights, development NGOs would call for worldwide diffusion of the technology. So we can all imagine these kinds of patterns and processes going on in relatively short order. Then, upon reading the experts group report, the Secretary General would convene a large so-called multi-stakeholders conference in one of the global cities in the world, and states would debate under the scrutiny of media, NGOs, corporations, other forms of activists, would debate and adopt eventually a very hard-fought, partly hollow declaration about geoengineering. Then probably 2 years later, the General Assembly would establish a working group, try to come up with an international convention on geoengineering, for instance, and things like that. So, of course, the geoengineering example is far-fetched, although perhaps not that much, to be honest, but let's say it's far-fetched. I don't think that the scenario that I've just given you is as well far-fetched, in the sense that perhaps the details would not exactly be the ones that I've given you, but overall, what I've described in terms of the global governance response to a kind of an exogenous shock in the world in the form of a technological change, this kind of infrastructure, a social infrastructure of global governance, which is comprised of typical practices, convening a global conference, putting together an experts group, NGO lobbying, and so on and so forth. This set of patterned ways of doing or globally governing the world is relatively established. It does evolve over time, right? A lot of the practices that I've just mentioned are relatively new. Most of them have emerged in the post-Cold War era, although certainly not, when it comes to international treaties. But some of them, at least, are relatively new. So there is some evolution around the edges, and yet there is a kind of unwritten script right? Because it's not written anywhere that that's how the world should react, right? There's not a treaty about how to react to a new technological development. This is an unwritten script that most actors and policymakers, as well as scholars, would recognize, and to a certain extent be able to predict, right? Not perfectly, perhaps, but the big trends. What's interesting about this is that compared to rules in the form of international law, for instance, or treaties, charters or resolutions, these practices are much less formal, right? They often lack a written or codified basis. They do yield some textual, artifacts in the end, but in terms of, okay, why do we resort to this or that practices, that's not written anywhere. And despite this informality, they really constitute what I think is a critical component of the architecture of global governance today. And so these practices are really important. I think they really oftentimes fly under the radar of scholars and sometimes as well of policymakers for some understandable reasons, in part because they're much harder to study, right? If you study international law, you can always find texts online or speeches and things like that. Practices, because of their informality, because of their sometimes improvisatory or experimenting nature, are seamless and much harder and diffuse to study. So what are practices? I don't want to bug you with details or theory too much, but essentially practices are socially meaningful, organized patterns of activities. Okay, a very simple example is handshaking as the practice of greeting, right? It varies historically, it varies culturally, there are ways to play with handshaking, but essentially, if I extend my hand towards Elodie, she knows I'm not punching her, I'm greeting her, right? And this same practice could have different meanings. If we had, if we're trying to reconcile, it may mean something else. If we're business partners, we can sort of sign a contract in this way. So the same kind of gesture is endowed with meaning, which varies over time, sometimes is contested, but which most practitioners are able to recognize more or less, right? Now, the thing is, global governance is full of that, right? We have to recognize the fact that what structures global governance is really not only written rules, but these kinds of gestures. Diplomacy, if you think a very obvious example, is very much based on practices, right? A lot of which are unwritten. New junior diplomats need, sometimes when they get to the UN, for instance, posted to the UN, need a full year to learn the practices of the United Nations before they can really practice their trade, right? If you think about global policymaking or global governance, practices of holding a press conference with the Secretary General, casting an abstention at the Security Council, which is not written anywhere, by the way. We can talk about that, but that's even against the UN Charter. Holding the pen, which is a very important practice, for instance, at the Security Council. The national delegations organizing cocktail parties at their national holidays, leadership positions that are attributed to certain countries in the hierarchy, forming groups of friends, launching advocacy coalitions of NGOs, and so on and so forth, right? Where you can see all kinds of patterned ways of governing globally that are not limited to states or to NGOs, but rather just are cutting across the board of international actors. So what's interesting about these meaningful and organized patterns of action is that they're recurring, right? And that's how we learn about them and learn to recognize them. And it's also that they're usually, you can find them somewhere in the interstices of rules, right? International rules are full of ambiguities, they're full of gaps, they're full of contradictions as well. And practitioners very often are left experimenting or filling the gaps, right? They're, the rules are not specific enough, and so the diplomats and other kinds of international practitioners have to patch these gaps and fill these gaps and improvise ways of doing things in order to resolve the problems of the day, right? So I'm just giving you a sample of practice, and this is something I did with Jean-Philippe Terrien, as I mentioned earlier. This is just a very small sample. You have the practices on the left-hand side. You will recognize what they are. Hosting a global conference. Again, this is relatively recent in the history of global governance. It starts in the 70s for the most part. Today, it's a very typical practice, right? There's not 1 year without a series of global conference, and most big important public policies at the global level are at least launched or initiated via a global conference. That's the case of SDGs, for instance. And there's a definition if you're interested. I'm not going to read it out loud. Mandating a group of experts. That's another one that's really, took on some speed over the past couple of decades. The rise of the expert on global governance, but essentially as a way of before states, for instance, get involved in a negotiation, a way of clearing some grounds consulting with different capitals, different groups of experts, and so on and so forth. The practice of accrediting NGOs, you may wonder, why am I putting this there? Because usually there are certain rules in the international organization's charter or some documents in terms of, okay, how do we accredit NGOs? That is, give them a badge so that they can attend, for instance, or even sometimes speak, like at the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. We felt that it was worth putting it there because our point is not that practices are completely unwritten, but rather that there's always a significant unwritten part. And if you look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for instance, it's a very short document adopted, I think, in the mid-90s that says, oh yeah, we can accredit NGOs. And then the rest of it is entirely based on practice, right? And varies a little bit with who's holding the Secretary General office. You know, and so a lot of how this works is based on everyday standard protocols which evolve over time. And finally, perhaps the most fast rising practice, I think, in global governance, in the 21st century, the so-called multi-stakeholders partnerships, right, which really have become a buzzword in global governance. Essentially, this idea that when you face a problem, you need to gather all stakeholders, that is to say, all participants that have a stake, right, in the issue of the day, and in a very flat network-like way and very heterogeneous in terms of the cast of actors, you bring them together. You're not trying to, come up with a treaty or anything like that. You're in a problem-solving type of approach to global governance. And so this one, for instance, in my view, is revolutionizing already multilateralism and global governance. Okay, what do I want to do with this sample and beyond? And I think you can imagine other practices beyond these. I want to make 2 points about these practices. And not just about global governance practices, frankly. The 2 points would apply to any practice. If you're doing other kind of social science, I think they're equally valid. One is that practices produce political effects that are Janus face. That is to say, that always have 2 sides to them that are both inclusionary and exclusionary. That's, again, something that Jean-Philippe Therrien and I have worked quite hard on to show that global governance practices, even when they are legitimated, as these 4 here, in terms of inclusiveness, right? If you look at how the UN, for instance, or other actors legitimize these new practices, it's in terms of, oh yeah, look, we have new actors now on the global stage. This is great, right? It's less state-centric than before. And so we definitely acknowledge this, right? I'm going to give a few more details in a minute about that. But Jean-Philippe and I really wanted to show that there's always exclusionary effects involved as well. And that's important for us to understand as political scientists or social scientists or citizens, right? That when we invent new ways of governing the globe, it comes with some political consequences, right? That tend to be mitigated, right? That tend to be, there are some pluses and minuses, right? And we should see clear through this. So that's the quintessential, if you think about it, political question. Who gets to participate? Who gets to decide? Who gets to, so it's about issues of access, about influence, accountability. And what we think, and I'm going to give you just a table that suggests, again, from work with Jean-Philippe, where this inclusion-exclusion dialectic is almost irreducible, right? So on the one hand, for instance, you could say these new practices, and again, try to keep both tables in your mind if you can at the same time. So a global conference broadens participation. So it gives voice to new actors. If you go to a global UN conference, NGOs now have, a way of intervening, for instance, that they didn't before. But then oftentimes it also rests on arbitrary selection criteria, right? The more radical NGOs, for instance, don't go to global conferences, right? Because they feel like there's too much normative homogeneity, for instance, or they know that they're not going to make it through the ECOSOC selection process. Another sort of way of thinking of this inclusion-exclusion dialectic on the second row here is to think, well, it does level up the playing field, right? Because most of these practices contain flatter forms of cooperation. If you think of multi-stakeholders partnership, clearly this is a relatively new way of putting states, corporations, experts, NGOs, all on the same stage, right, around the same table, and then coming together. But then what we also saw is that it also reproduces and sometimes even reinforces some inequalities that pre-existed these new practices. The most obvious example is how, the arrival of NGOs on the global stage has essentially reinforced the North, against the South, in the sense that there are far more Northern NGOs, and the North was already dominant, than there are Southern NGOs that make it to this global level. And in that sense, it's hard to see this as a more inclusive political stage. And then the last point we wanted to suggest is that these practices do enhance accountability because they foster public debate and transparency, right? There is an element of publicity to these practices that is lacking, for instance, in intergovernmental negotiations, right? Which most of the time happen behind closed doors. But we also felt that very often, these practices do marginalize certain viewpoints. If you think about the rise of experts, for instance, right? Well, it's all good and well, and I guess most of us are experts in some way, and so we can see some advantages there. But it does decrease the legitimacy, for instance, of the citizens' viewpoint, right? Or the subjects of public policy, the targets, right? The people that are the poor, for instance, who have a very different claim to legitimacy and participation than knowing what works and what not based on expert knowledge. Long story short, essentially, this is just a way of saying, let's not get overexcited, about the new practices. Clearly, there are some advantages, but I think we should keep a cold head about it and also try to scratch a little deeper sometimes and see some of the more negative effects that come with it. I said I wanted to make 2 points about the practices. And the second one, which is the one that I really want to insist on today, but I felt this one was important, especially in light of the work I did with Jean-Philippe. The second point I want to make, which is more connected to my own research, is that these global governance practices, they transform, right, over time, but they transform in a very weird or unusual way. They transform in and through practices themselves. Okay, so that's, I'm going to explain what I mean by this, but essentially practices transform through practices. Right? What that means is that there are few moments in the contemporary evolution of global governance, few constitutional moments, like San Francisco, for instance, right? Where you can say, oh yeah, okay, we all sit down, think really hard, debate, and then draft and negotiate and come up with a kind of proto-constitution, the UN Charter, for instance. Today, a lot of these changes happen, like I said, through very incremental processes, low-key, small-scale processes. And so practices change through practices. I'll give you very concrete examples in a few minutes. But what that means is that obviously for us as observers or as citizens interested in global politics, it's a bit harder to keep track of what's going on, right? Because it's changing in a very informal and under the radar type of way without the glare of media headlines, for instance. What I want to suggest, essentially, and that's just one concept that I borrow from anthropology, actually, from a French anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, is that instead of, usually in global governance or in multilateralism, we say that institutions are designed, right? So you have policymakers that are more or less rational, that are confronted with a problem, and that will rationally design what they think are the most efficient rules of the game, so whether through legal forms of other, to address these problems, right? That's the dominant understanding in international relations, certainly. I sort of want to take the counterpoint of this and suggest that actually that's very idealized, right? This story about the rational design, that what we rather see is a global bricolage. And bricolage is essentially, and I guess in English, the word that it doesn't translate exactly what it means, but comes closest would be a handyman, right? So a bricoleur is someone that builds new artifacts from whatever heterogeneous materials that are available in front of him or her, right? So you have all kinds of things as a handyman or handywoman, obviously, and you try to build something from what's in front of you, right? So, of course, there's an element of design, but it's not design from scratch. It's the patching together, the bricolage of the elements that are in front of you. And Lévi-Strauss would contrast that with an engineer, right, who's doing exactly the opposite. Through a blueprint, right, on a piece of paper, tries to come up with a plan and then builds. The bricoleur builds from whatever is at hand, okay? So it's a way of contrasting, if you wish, the dominant understanding of how we do global governance, and especially how global governance changes, and what I will suggest is actually happening. And so some of the characteristics, very quickly, because I think they're all pointing in the same direction. There's no blueprint. It's a much more haphazard process, right? There's a logic to it. A bricoleur doesn't do anything, right? The bricoleur is actually quite logical, but it's a practical logic of sort of patchwork as opposed to blueprint. a lot of it is learning by doing. Right? And I think that's kind of important if we want to understand what's going on. You learn to create as you create. Right? Just like a child learns a language by speaking, right? Not by reading a grammar book. Obviously, a lot of what human beings learn actually is done by doing. We're kind of, I think, victims of our own representational bias sometimes. A lot of it is trial and error. And if you think about all the failings of global governance, I don't think I need to convince you that there are mistakes made, but there are lots of trials, right? It's a concept that's gaining popularity right now, experimental global governance, and I think it is touching on something where over time, and it's not that new, to be honest, maybe now we have we see it more obviously, but I don't think it's new to the 21st century that, confronted with a problem, we try stuff, and then when we fail, we try something different, right? A lot of improvisation, like I said, the fact of the matter is that rules are never finite, right? It's impossible to create a legal code that covers all particular circumstances, as we know, right? And so there's inherently a lot of improvisation in policy making at whatever level. I'm focusing on global governance today. A lot of experimentation, I've already mentioned it. And then the final one, a lot of recombination. And that's important because I want to make an argument about the evolution of global governance, right? And so when all of these things happen, trial and error, improvisation, experimentation, it never occurs from scratch. It's always a recombination, remember my bricoleur or handyman, of what's been done in the past. Sometimes we do evolve new things, right? But even these new things, as I show you with some examples, are borrowed from other fields, right? It's relatively rare that you have a moment of full creativity, in social life. Most of the time, it's much more about recombining things. And so what that means is that there's a lot of path dependence, right? Despite the fact that there is also change, right? But it's change based on what's existing. All right, I'm getting to a couple of examples now. And the first example I want to address is a paper that is forthcoming. If you're interested, I can provide you with the reference later. It's not out yet, but it will be forthcoming, in which I've tried to study in as detailed a way as I could how exactly it came to be that in 2015, 2016, a lot of new practices were grafted or layered onto the existing procedure of selecting the United Nations Secretary General, right? Some of these things, and I'm just giving you a couple of examples, there were public hearings. It had never occurred in the history of the United Nations that all candidates would sit down and face either the General Assembly, but also some NGOs and other interested parties, and have to respond to questions, present their visions of the job, of the UN, of the world, and so on and so forth. Webcast on TV, Al Jazeera broadcasted it. There was a website that was launched by the PGA, the President of the General Assembly, to allow private individuals, and hopefully some of you guys, there were lots of Mexican citizens, by the way, that posted questions via Twitter, Instagram, whatever, to be asked to the Secretary General as part of the public hearings, for instance. Okay? And then this is more perhaps procedural, bureaucratic, but it actually played a very important role. Historically, as I'm sure you guys know, the General Assembly and the Security Council are in a tense relationship, let's put it that way, right? And there has been very limited collaboration historically between the presidents of each institution. And then for the first time ever, the two presidents came together, they signed a joint letter to determine the nomination process in advance. The steps, they talked about the public hearings, for instance, and they provided criteria for, again, unheard of for the job, talked about the need for a female candidate, for instance, that didn't turn out to work that well. But anyway, a kind of an agreed upon framework for. Now the question is, how exactly did we get to this? And just before you tell me, but this is, does this really matter? Maybe some of you are skeptical. I think it matters a lot. Right, and we have to see this in the longer term. First of all, there are lots of insiders that suggested in written form, so I think they were pretty serious, that Guterres won in large part because he mastered the public hearings, for instance, and a number of other practices better than others. Right, so in a way, his public stance sort of, to a certain extent, led to his nomination. But beyond that, I think that we can all agree that a Secretary General that's selected through the court of worldwide public opinion is likely to have a slightly different agenda than one that's the lowest common denominator chosen by the P5, the permanent members, the P5 behind closed doors, right? Which has been historically the kinds of Secretary Generals we've had. We've seen Ban Ki-moon, for instance, who essentially made sure not to rock the boat, right? And already we can see that Guterres is a different kind of Secretary General. There is a spillover effect, and this we already see, right? I'm talking about very recent changes. Since 2016, lots of other UN agencies and beyond have adopted the same procedure. This is very important, right? So a couple of the Director General of the UNESCO, the WHO, the World Health Organization, the selection of the PGA has transformed as well, the President of the General Assembly. So those are just a couple of examples to perhaps suggest that this matters a lot. What's striking about these changes is that there were no formal amendments made to the UN Charter, to the Security Council Rules of Procedure, to any document that presides over UN procedure. None, right? They were all adopted in and through practices, sort of grafted, like I said, or layered upon the existing procedure, which is very vague. Essentially, the Charter says, Article 97, that the Secretary General shall be appointed by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. That's the extent of specificity that there is. And historically, the way it's been done is Security Council decides behind closed doors, mostly the P5. It's developed its own practices, some of which I can talk about, and then forwards one name. Again, that's not written anywhere that it should forward one name only, right? It could be a competitive election at the General Assembly, but in practice, that's how it's evolved to the General Assembly. And even the General Assembly has historically not even taken a vote, right? It's the Secretary General is elected by acclamation. So that's just to show you how, practices have evolved out of a rule that clearly didn't suggest those practices, right? Other ways of doing it could have happened. And so what I tried to do in the paper is resolve three puzzles, okay, which are on the left-hand side. The timing, right? Why did it occur in 2016? If you look at the General Assembly resolutions about the nomination of Secretary General in 96, so Kofi Annan, in 2006, Ban Ki-moon, it makes the exact same request to do the kinds of things that were done in 2016, but it didn't work out, right? So the question is, okay, nothing has really changed. The rules haven't changed. There are clearly some players interested in changing, but others that are veto points. Why did it all of a sudden occur in 2016 and not before? Then why did it take the form that it did? Why public hearings, for instance? Why this website, right, for citizens to ask questions? And finally, the magnitude. Why did the change go only so far, right? Because I don't want to sound overly optimistic. Ultimately, even after all these public hearings and open surveys and all of that, it's still the Security Council that forwarded one name, right? And so I want also to show you how even in practice, the Security Council made use of its practices to push back and say, whoa, let's relax. Okay, we've allowed you to do it, but definitely we're still the ones forwarding one name, okay? And what I put on the right-hand side are practices that are fundamental to the UN today. Most of them were not that prevalent 10, 20 years ago. So in the previous two episodes, right? If you think about groups of friends that had started to emerge, but it's really institutionalized. So essentially it's a practice of when a group of countries have a similar view on a similar issue, they form a group of friends. It's a loose coalition, coordinate, and then get the Secretary General's ear or whoever is in power. The worldwide survey, just to give you another example, is something that had just been experimented by the UN 2 years before, a year and a half before, with the SDGs. For the first time ever, the United Nations had decided to run a worldwide survey. And then when the President of the General Assembly, a former politician, arrived in New York, he said, hey, that's interesting. It's just been done before his tenure. It's a one-year tenure. He said, why don't we apply that to the nomination process of the Secretary General as well, right? So you can see it was available there. It wasn't available before. So it helped him do something highly controversial, right? Because nominating the Secretary General is a high politics issue par excellence, right? We're talking about the great powers that want to have their man, it's always been man, in a position, right? So it was highly controversial, but the fact that he could say, well, look, we've just done it. Let's do it again, right? I have all the infrastructure anyway. The best practices narrative was very important as well, right? This is a narrative that's been growing on the United Nations for 20 years. It comes out of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, most of it, and it has spread through public administration practices, you guys know, all the way to the United Nations. And even the Joint Inspections Unit, which is this kind of review panel within the United Nations had raised the issue in 2009, saying, well, we have to look at the best practices when we nominate our senior positions, director of the WHO. But we know the Secretary General is a different thing. And so we don't want to apply it in 2009. And then in 2016, the proponents, the advocates of change say, well, why? Why should the Secretary General be so different? And then they're able to legitimize their rather heterodox proposition. And then if you look at the last row, to make a long story short, there you see the Security Council practices. So there you see the Security Council that at first says, all right, we'll do it. Some countries were completely opposed to these changes. If you take Russia, for instance, was completely opposed to it. They let it go for a while, but then ultimately they were really, really not excited. China, not so much either. It was mostly the United Kingdom that was enthusiastic about this transformation. But then the story that I tell in the paper, if you're interested, obviously for the little story, I think you would have to read the whole thing, is how the Security Council then resorted to its own practices, most of which, again, are not written anywhere, in order to push back, right? So straw polls, for instance, is a practice that Security Council has developed. Instead of voting on candidates, which would force them to have a record and meet in a public session, they don't want to do that, right? They want to meet behind closed doors. So they invented a straw poll practice by which they can encourage, discourage, or I think there's an abstention option, all the candidates, but that's not a vote. See what I mean? It's a vote, but it's not a vote, right? It's not recorded. It's a straw poll. And then after a couple of rounds, they introduce color-coded ballots. So the P5 get, I don't know, like pink ballots, and others get blue, so that everybody can start to see, without knowing who's voting for and against, but if there's a pink no, for instance, that's a potential veto. Okay, so that candidate is discarded, for instance. You can see how they've evolved practices in order to, get to the point of selecting someone without having to face public scrutiny. And so they made use of this, closed meetings, non-papers, right? So Security Council, as I'll show you with my second case, is very, very skeptical of codifying its practices, right? Because it wants this flexibility. It wants to be able to adapt and shift quickly. And so they do non-papers, right? The European Union does that as well, where countries can make some claims and even say, well, this is how we've done it today, but that's not a paper. So that, plausible deniability. They can always say, well, that was just, China that wrote a piece of paper, but the Security Council didn't endorse it, right? And so that's how they try to maintain this kind of gray zone of semi-institutionalization. So anyway, long story short, that's the story I tell, really a story of clashing practices and how consistently throughout the process, the actors made use of a variety of practices to transform the selection process. I have to run quickly. Can I very quickly say a few things about my second example, Iridi? Okay, which is about the Security Council practices. Okay, and again, I put forward, that's another paper, that one is under review, so I don't know exactly what will happen with it. So new ways of doing things at the Security Council. Very quickly, you guys perhaps know what they are. There are ARIA formula meetings, which allow civil society representatives. Diego Aria was Venezuelan, I was going to say, diplomat. Pen holding, which essentially provides most of the time it's the permanent members a sort of control over a given issue, right? Open debates to have other countries, for instance, thematic sessions, wrap-up debates, interactive dialogues. They've invented a bunch of weird formats in order to expand beyond. Meetings with troop contributors, regional organizations, the way in which they allocate chairmanships of subsidiary committees. Long story short, okay, so there are lots of new ways of conducting business at the Security Council. And it's all of these things have emerged exactly through the processes I've been talking about in the past 30 minutes. No amendment to the charter, no changes to the Council's rules of procedure, nothing, right? They're practices changing in and through practices, right? And they matter a lot. And so what I tried to do in that other project is to show how the diplomats themselves and the Security Council allow each other to invent new practices. So they allow each other to do new things. They're not even sure exactly how they're going to agree on whether they agree or not, right? Because they don't follow the amendment procedure, for instance. And so they're really in that gray zone. That's why I use that concept in the paper of semi-formality, right? So they try to proto-codify. So for instance, they will do presidential notes, right? So that's how what we have in terms of codification of the new practices are through presidential notes. So Japan, for the most part, gets elected to the Security Council, takes it upon himself to, when they hold a monthly presidency, to produce a note that lists all the new practices and gets adopted by the other countries. So that's the extent of codification. But the interesting thing, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, is that the practice of issuing a presidential note is not written anywhere itself. So you see this sort of the snake eats its own tail in the sense that they formalize practices through practices that are not formalized themselves, right? So there's something very, very interesting, I think, from a political perspective. And so I give a number of examples in that paper. I can come back to this perhaps in the Q&A if people are interested, of how as well they train each other in these new practices, because they're not written anywhere. So the Finns have taken it upon themselves to do a yearly workshop with the new elected members to train the delegations. The secretariat will do workshops as well, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to go in more of these details if there's enough time. But I want to leave you perhaps with concluding thoughts on these. That's the SDGs, if ever there's interest. Concluding thoughts about what I've been talking about, where, the takeaway points perhaps for you to ponder after the session. So global governance, I think, is increasingly transforming informally and through small-scale, low-key changes. And the question is, well, what does that mean politically? I'm a political scientist, but perhaps you can ask the same question from a different angle. And I'm going to list advantages and disadvantages, and obviously the terminology is a bit normatively biased, but I just wanted to at least get some thinking and debate going on, perhaps. In terms of advantages, clearly this way of transforming global governance fosters adaptability, right, and flexibility. It's much more flexible than amending the charter. Security Council is never going to be reformed through a charter amendment. We all know that. Experience is very clear. But the Security Council has changed in practice a lot, right, but informally, right? So it's much more adaptable in that way. I think an argument can be made that these practices on the whole are more participatory because they're more bottom-up, right? A lot of these practices, just take the way in which the Secretary General got elected, for instance. It got some involvement from non-state actors in a way that was unprecedented. Possibly it's more effective. I want to leave that as an open question, but, a lot of these practices at the Security Council actually have produced outcomes in a way that perhaps typical, more formal practices might not have. Now let's come to the disadvantages, right? If you evolve global governance in that way in multilateralism, right, practices change through practices, you get a very fragmented architecture, right? Why? Because there's no coordination in the way in which things evolve, right? It evolves in a kind of patchwork manner, small islands of evolution here and there, but then how exactly can we make this coherent is a completely new question. And then I think it's also subject to capture, right? Informality sometimes benefits the weaker parties, most of the time benefits the stronger parties, right? Informality is a mechanism of domination. And I didn't have a chance to get there, but perhaps in the Q&A, but some of these practices clearly lead, pen holding, for instance, at the Security Council, clearly have even augmented the P5's tremendous advantage over the rest of the Council. Some of these practices are quite opaque, right? In large part because they're not written. There's no public accountability because of that, right? The mechanisms of accountability, of participation are opaque. They're not easy to understand. And that's a big problem from a democratic perspective at the very least. These practices, I think, and that's more, again, a kind of open question, but I suspect also lead to softer forms of global governance and multilateralism. If you believe in soft global governance, that's not a problem, but I think that enough red flags have been raised so far with multi-stakeholders partnership, for instance, for fighting disease and things like that, that we should at least be wary of the possibility that the harder form, so governance with teeth, essentially, through law or compliance mechanisms, are being displaced by softer mechanisms. And the last one is that this evolution sometimes is partial in two senses. First, it's normatively biased. I think that we increasingly see, and it's too bad I didn't have a chance to talk about the SDG case, because that's, I think, where it shows the clearest that a lot of these practices, so for instance, in the SDGs, the way now that the policy development policy, that's the master development policy in global governance today, it's based on indicators, right? It's great, right? And there are lots of advantages, but at the same time, we're very far from the kind of rule-making, for instance, mechanisms that countries from the South have been calling for decades, right? It's much more about self-governance and sort of cooperative and learning and things like that. And the other sense in which it's partial is that I think I've mentioned it, possibly incoherent and disparate in the way in which we address problems, right? So some problems will be left out in all likelihood because of this more partial approach, and that's potentially a problem. So I want to leave you with both sides of the coin, right? You guys can make your own minds and determine what you think, but at the very least, I hope I convinced you that these things are actually very important. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Vincent, por su presentación, perdón. Ya entre los 3 idiomas ya no, a esta hora ya comienzo a mezclarme, perdón. Entonces voy a abrir a sus preguntas primero. Si no quieren hacerlas en inglés, puedo traducirlas al francés, me ofrezco en la medida de lo posible. Y vamos a tomar, no sé, unas 2, 3 reacciones. Si se animan, si no, yo tengo una lista, pero si se animan, pues no las voy a hacer, ¿no? Entonces, Ángel, ¿me ayudas, por favor? Con este ahí, por favor. No va a hacer ruido, es para los que están en streaming.
Well, thank you for everything. I was wondering, yesterday you were commenting about the efforts of different countries to reform the coding of the Group of 5 within the Security Council. I was wondering if any of these countries like Brazil or India were trying or actively trying to reform either the Security Council or the General Assembly through these informal practices.
Should I go one by one, or what's the practice?
That's a practice here. ¿Hay otra reacción? ¿O otra pregunta? ¿Sí?
Haré la pregunta en español.
Sí.
Quisiera, profesor, si nos describe, ¿qué tan rápido podría ir esta transformación de las prácticas o este proceso de practicar las prácticas de la gobernanza global con la realidad de los problemas internacionales? ¿Puede ir a la par o puede que en algún punto se desfasen tanto que la ONU ya no tenga esta capacidad para resolver los problemas globales?
Ok. Sí. La rapidité de transformation des pratiques via la pratique, si ça permet à la ONU d'être plus réactive à l'évolution des problèmes globaux ou si ça n'empêche pas un certain déphasage. Una última, ¿sí?
Very, very interesting, your work. I guess I have the very standard questions. Who benefits from informality? The first one. Because all the literature, the kind of Anne-Marie Slaughter kind of thing about governance and networks, which are basically informal. Informality does benefit, typically, the organizations or the states with more resources. Why would the United Nations do that? Because it cannot change the rules of the game, because it would be dangerous to do that, or because it's easier for some to work in this way. I have a hard time understanding why this would be a way of leveling off the playing field. Why would this be a way of increasing accountability? That's the very standard questions, the first. And the second is whether an IR person is well suited and trained to do this kind of job. I mean, wouldn't an anthropologist or the sociologists even, be more suited and well trained to do this, because one has to sit there, do interviews, watch, in order to get what is an informal practice. I wonder how IR people are reacting to your work.
Muchas gracias. Entonces le voy a dar la palabra para que responda estas tres primeras intervenciones.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for the questions. They're very important. I'm going to go in order. So, Hendra, about the South's role in changing Security Council practices. The most important group of states, because you're talking about states, right? In the way your question was framed, so governments, is called ACT, Accountability. Is it coherence? I'm not quite sure about the C, but anyway, ACT, coherence and transparency, I think. The C, I'm not sure at 100%. And that's a group of friends, right? So that's a group of like-minded nations that has come together. It flows from the small five. I don't know how knowledgeable of the details you guys are, but essentially the small five were five small nations, Liechtenstein and a couple of others, that had come together to make this case for more transparency at the United Nations. Switzerland was one of them. And it really got shut down, right, in the years 2000, quite harshly by the big guys at the UN. And it sort of came back to life, but this time through a larger group and with middle powers, right? And I'm not quite sure if Mexico is a member of ACT, but frankly, it could very well be. You would have to Google it and check, but it's about 25 to 30 countries. I didn't check. I should have checked coming to Mexico. I apologize for that. And that's the major vehicle at the intergovernmental level that's pushing for this transparency. As you know fully well, Angela as well, Mexico has also been at the forefront of a very important initiative that hasn't, frankly, delivered tangible effects, at least not this far, for coming up with a kind of a code of conduct that wouldn't be formal, at least legal, a code of conduct in the use of the veto, right? So Mexico did that with France. I think it was France's initiative, but then Mexico teamed up with them. That was a couple of years ago. Their goal was precisely not to frighten other P5 by saying, we're going to amend the charter, because obviously I think they knew that would never fly. And so they said, well, we're all going to commit publicly that we're not going to use the veto in case of genocide and crime. I forget the exact phrasing, but it was something like that, right? There were some issues that should be out of the bounds of the veto. Right? So that's another very important move. And if, sometimes when you try to affect change, you have to take a longer term view, right? The fact that they didn't take off immediately, in my view, is certainly no cause for despair. A lot of the things I've been talking about had been debated for a long time, right? And so chances are, in my view, that these kinds of changes will occur. When it comes to the Secretary General, just to enlarge it a bit beyond the Security Council, what's important is that despite the fact none of these changes have been codified or legalized, they set precedents, right? Precedents are very important in social life and in politics. You don't need to be in law for precedent. My kids, in the way that I educate them, see precedents in the way that I've behaved in the past, and they invoke them if I change and if I'm not coherent. And so, I think precedents have an inherently powerful logic in social life, in society, as well as in global politics. And I really don't see the next Secretary General being selected without these kinds of new practices. Maybe there will be more, right? Because there were some proposals that didn't make the cut. For instance, some countries, India, because you wanted me to address some southern suggestions, wanted to have more than one names being forwarded to the General Assembly. A lot of countries like Colombia was at the forefront of having a female candidates only, for instance. And so a lot of these things didn't work, and I'm quite sure that the countries will come back. When you look at how the reaction at the Security Council per se to how to sort of, without amending the rules formally, but trying to inscribe in texts, kind of semi-formal text, the way that I described it, it's been mostly done by the North. So the Japanese are really the masterminds on the Presidential Notes 507. They've done 3 iterations of it, and everybody recognizes that it's the Japanese that do that, which is really weird if you think about it, because they're kind of self-appointed. But they invest a lot of energy and they do it. And all other countries participate in it and recognize then that, yeah, that's our kind of semi-formal code of conduct. Then in terms of enshrining the new procedure for selecting the Secretary General, again, Japan was at the forefront. And then from ACT, I think it was Estonia. So all that to say, in response to your question, I think there's a lot of room for more Southern involvement and leadership in democratizing some of these practices. Now, to the question whether the UN is more reactive, that's a very important question, I think. When you look at what's been going on, for instance, at the Security Council, I think it's relatively clear that the Council's adaptability has been enhanced through these kinds of changes, right? If you go back to 1991, 1992, so end of the Cold War, everybody was saying the Security Council is dated, it doesn't work, it doesn't represent the world anymore, we need to change it. There were very, very few countries that would say something else. Actually, everybody would say that at the very least. There are still a lot of countries that make that claim, and it's a very legitimate claim in my view, at least. But the fact that the Council was able to evolve all these new ways of doing things, right, and get NGOs once in a while, to address the Council, despite the fact it's not written anywhere, or come up with a system of allocating chairmanships, so the way they allocate chairmanships, and that's very important, folks. It never makes the headlines, but, when you're chairman of, for instance, the tourism subcommittee, you control the list of, sanctions and all of that, right, with the other members. And so the way it's allocated and all of that, these are very significant, politically significant practices. And perhaps the best example of adaptability and reactivity for the Security Council before and large is abstention. And again, this is for me one of the least well-known story. Abstention is not in the Charter. The Charter says the opposite. The Charter says that in order to adopt a resolution, you need 9 concurring votes, including the concurring votes of the permanent members. Concurring means positive, right? So essentially it says you cannot abstain. If you abstain, it's similar. But it's a practice that's evolved in the late 40s, early 50s. The great powers realized they would have trouble, working out some deals. And so they said, okay, we're going to allow each other to abstain. And so obviously the Council's adaptability and reactivity, I think, despite the fact that it's highly problematic, okay, I don't want to sound like an enthusiastic because I'm not, but still, in the grand scheme of things, its adaptability has increased. In terms of the UN writ large, I think it's hard not to make the case. The thing is that the reason why your question is difficult to answer is that the reactivity is increased in terms of, its possibilities to do something. I'm much less convinced that what it does is necessarily more efficient. You see what I mean? So I think that it sort of augments the toolkit, right? So it means that the UN is able, as a sort of big boat, is able to resort to new ways of doing things that it wouldn't have if it were just for the Charter. But I think we need to, like I said, keep a cool head on this and see that, for instance, the SDGs an improvement over previous development policies? In some ways they are, because they cover more grounds, they're more transversal, they were more participatory in the making. I mean, I can see a number of ways, but at the same time, are they going to be more efficient? Is there going to be more development? Frankly, the jury is still out, but I'm skeptical. And so I think, the best way to answer your question is yes, the toolkit is being expanded. Whether these new tools are going to be effective, in my view, is very much an open question. The third question was about who benefits from informality. So that's a very good question. Of course, as political scientists, that's what we want to know. And I really share your skepticism. I hope it came across in my, just that slide, for instance. I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily a positive development. I've tried to emphasize that a lot of these new practices have very clear exclusionary effects, for instance. But the question, in a way, so who benefits from informality? Like I said, I've written an entire book about that in case you're interested. It's called International Pecking Orders, and that's very much about the making of international hierarchies through these informal mechanisms, right? And I would say, I was very much pressed with that question whenever I would present it, and I always thought that was a very good question that I wanted to answer myself. Who benefits? And frankly, the only conclusion I could come up with is what I've said in my talk. most of the time it's the dominant that benefit from that. But I would lie if I were not to admit that there were instances where weaker agents did benefit from informal practices. It provided them with new kinds of opportunities and ways of circumventing deadlocks and veto points. And again, the Secretary General's nomination process is a very good example of that. Who were the challengers here? A coalition of NGOs called One for 7 Billions, a group called the Elders, then ACT member states, right? But they were, a very tiny group if you think about it. So, in this sense, this is a case where those that clearly didn't have institutional power were able, through these new practices, to effect change, right? And then in the book, which was about a slightly different topic, I give a number of other examples like this, where small countries, for instance, if we want to stick to the intergovernmental level, have been able, through the use of practices like this, coalition making or groups, if you think of a country like Egypt, for instance, that's one of my favorite examples, because they're past masters at leading groups, right? Whatever, the G77 or the Islamic Conference and so on and so forth. And their profile historically, perhaps less so in the past 10 years, because there's been a lot of domestic turmoil, but historically, at least, their diplomatic profile has greatly benefited from that. Why? Because anytime the Secretary General needs to talk to someone from the South, Egypt is the obvious spokesperson, for instance. So that's just one example. I could perhaps give more. So it's hard for me to say informality is inherently bad, right? But I think overall, it's dangerous. I agree. And the fourth question about whether IR is suited for this, I'm actually very glad you asked that question. I don't see you anymore. Perhaps you're at the back. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm glad you asked that question because, in a way, for me, I think IR should have been doing that since the beginning. If I'm honest, I think that studying the everyday processes and practice, whether we use the concept of practice or not, is completely off the point, frankly. But the everyday work and processes of politics strikes me, of politics made by people of flesh and blood, strikes me as, perhaps it's just me, but as sort of almost like the default mode of understanding social processes. And the fact that we stayed in the armchair or did other kinds of studies, in my view, is certainly no reason to say, well, anthropologists have been doing that for decades or even a century at least, so we should leave it to them. I think we can learn a lot from them. I think you're right, especially their methods, ethnography, participant observation, shadowing. They've been experimenting with a bunch of really, really interesting methods. But then this is all there. There's a huge corpus which we can draw inspiration from and apply to our own problematiques, right? Because sometimes we don't ask the same kinds of questions. There is a very interesting stream of political anthropology, for instance, and there are books from anthropologists today. There's one that came out recently that's called Palaces of Hope, and it's written by political anthropologists, and the Palaces of Hope are the IO headquarters, right? And so they're getting there. But historically, I don't think that it's been their favorite object to go global and international. And so in a way, for me, instead of saying that's not our turf, I think rather let's exploit the synergies. I think they're fantastic. And how's my work received? That I'm not the best person to respond to that, but at the very least, I think there's curiosity enough that I see quite a few people doing something similar. That is to say, trying to understand the everyday practices of global governance, whatever they are. There is also a movement in international law of studying international law as a practice, because it is a practice, and so I'm reasonably optimistic that this can make some headways.
Okay. Entonces todavía tenemos algo de tiempo para otras reacciones, si quieren, por favor.
Yes, well, I have two very precise questions that are inspired by the debate that we can that exists in the neo-institutionalist perspective on politics. The first question is, do you ask yourself under which conditions these informal practices turn or may turn into formal practices? And the second question is, and it's linked to the first question, do you think that most of the actors involved in the process that you study at the global governance level, most of them recur to informal practices because it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to transform the formal norms and procedures of the global governance?
Well, good evening. Thank you for the conference. It was really interesting. I get how the Secretary General election process was different in 2016 from all the processes before. But does it really had a different result? I mean, like different practices to really have a different result? Because I think that Antonio Guterres is a very similar profile to the two former Secretary Generals of the United Nations. After Boutros-Ghali failure on Rwanda and other global governance failures, United Nations turned to look for more representative profiles, and that's how Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon arrived to the office. And I don't really think that Antonio Guterres is a very different profile of these two profiles. So does these different processes really have different results? Because I really think that it was kind of similar to prior processes.
Thank you very much for your conference. I think it is very interesting, and this is more like a provocation because I really like your work, and this type of constructivism I find very promising. However, and here comes a provocation, my question is to what extent your concept of practice differs from this idea of implicit decision-making procedures that is always comprised in the definition of regimes by Krasner. Because it's really what we're talking about, implicit practices and implicit decision-making procedures. That's my question. Then I have two observations. One of them is, I don't think it is the fact that these practices are exclusionary brings them apart from the rest of global governance. In the end, that's what we're talking about, governance and not government. And if there's anything that we always criticize about international organizations and these kinds of structures is precisely their democratic deficit. Nobody has ever voted for any of them, actually. So in this sense, it's not something that brings them apart from the rest. And the other one is more like a question. I think global governance structures are always a bit late, like the world changes and then global governance practices change. And I can see how these practices in a way respond to or are a product of this liberal consensus as in this opening and civil society being very vocal and being very empowered. And I can see with a bit of pessimism what is happening right now and this liberal consensus being under attack. And my question is, to what extent do you think that the fact that, you actually referred to this crisis of multilateralism, but the fact that the way not only global structures of governance are changing right now, but also the leadership of the important countries here, and how civil society is probably being curtailed. To what extent do you think this is going to change these practices in the future? Or do you think they're going to evolve in a parallel way?
Muchas gracias.
Okay, that's not 3 questions, that's like 6. Okay, let me go in order. So Jean-François, so on neo-institutionalism and all of this, clearly there are, and actually that question was quite close to your first question, so perhaps I can try to put them together. So the title of that piece is actually Historical Institutionalism Meets Practice Theory. Okay, and that's just to recognize from the get-go that it's obvious to me that there are some clear synergies between these two research approaches. For those of you who have been using historical institutionalism or practice theory, and the paper, it's coming out in international organization, is trying to set up that dialogue between the two frameworks by showing, first of all, how practices differ from institutions. They're similar and related concepts, no doubt, especially if you have an understanding of institutions as rules of the game, right? The kind of Douglas North understanding, which involves both formal and informal dimensions. But there are two big differences that I try to suggest in the paper. One is that institutions tend to operate at a slightly higher level, right? Practices in the way at least that they've been operationalized so far in IR and in a lot of social sciences are a bit more granular, right? They happen at a slightly lower level of aggregation. And the second important difference, which I think is much more important, I'm going to take just a classic example of the marriage. The marriage is an institution, right? Comes with its own rules, and we all know what they are. The practice of wedding is what gives spin to the institution. So practice is very much the enactment of rules as opposed to the rules themselves. And marriage as an institution rests on wedding as an anchoring practice, but then on a bunch of other practices like living together, organizing family parties, and so on and so forth, right? And without those practices, the institution would falter, right? And so in that way, practices and institutions are very much imbricated together, but they're not exactly the same thing. And what I'm talking about in that case, the Secretary General's case, is the institution doesn't really change. It changes around the edges, but frankly, not that much. It's the practices that change, right? The institution changes a little bit as well, but frankly, I would say that's why historical institution is called incremental and endogenous change, right? It's almost self-adapting change, self-reinforcing change in a way, right? Which is a weird category, but still resonates, I think. And then your sub-question, Jean-François, was under which conditions do these informal practices turn into formal? I think that's an empirical question, to be honest. I don't think that there's that much we can say, sort of theoretically. For instance, it's been 150, 200 years in a world of increasing legalization. So the practice of law, generally, not just international law, is increasingly prevalent. Bureaucratization is sort of the sister practice here. And so in that sense, the conditions under which informal practices formalize have just been growing for 200 years. There are limits to this, right? Because I've been talking about practices today that shy away from formalization. So it's not, either or, but at the same time, I think the best way to answer your question is really empirically to look at it. I'm not quite sure that we can, at least in general terms, sort of take a stance on this. Are informal practices more prevalent because it's impossible to transform formal practices? Definitely, at least in the two cases that I had enough time to address. I just wanted very quickly, because I know it's Q&A, I don't want to but if you take SDGs, for instance, that's not the case. You didn't see all those informal practices on the left-hand side because it was impossible to go intergovernmental, right? It was much more about the fact that there were some players thought that it was better that way. They negotiated their practices. They improvised a lot. If you look at how the process was done, it took Jean-Philippe and I years to just understand, because it was a streams of parallel processes going on at the same time that were eventually conjoined together. The financing part, the sustainable, the development, all of that was brought together. A lot of improvisation. And so I don't think that case would fit the story that, it's informal because the formal doesn't work. I think it is the case sometimes, in many cases, more than sometimes, but I don't think that that's the only mechanism that's operating. Do we have a different result because of the process? I think the jury's still out. Okay, so the only thing I can do is quote and refer, as I do in the paper, to a couple of insiders that make that claim. Okay, I don't know myself. I was not involved. And so people from the PGA's office, people from, one is Sam Dawes, for instance, who's one of the most reputed UN observer, who claimed that. And, what he says is that there were, for instance, a lot of people thought it should be a female. A lot of people said it should be Eastern European. The fact that a Western European male in his 60s or 70s, I don't quite know, in a way defied what the narrative had been in the preceding 18 months, of more than that, of saying, in a way, Guterres had exactly the profile that pretty much everybody was calling against, right? This is, partly convincing and partly unconvincing, because in a way you could say, well, but that's why he won. That's because he sort of, fit the usual profile. But at the very least, I think you can say that if you look at what people were saying, the next Secretary General's profile should be, it wasn't Guterres's at all. It was the opposite of Guterres's. And so I think the best, and that's a bit of a cop-out for your question, but at the same time, I think the best evidence we're going to get is in the next couple of selection processes. That all of this was very new. A lot of people didn't fully understand what was going on. A lot of countries were sort of dépassés. I'm not quite sure how to say that in English, but they were just like trying to keep pace with the changes. They were trying to adapt. And so I think we're going to need a couple more. But my suspicion is that it will change. It will change the profile for some of the reasons I mentioned. Okay, practices versus implicit practices. Hopefully I've sort of addressed this with the point on institutionalism. Exclusionary is no different. I agree with you that, I didn't mean to. The reason why I felt this was a point, and Jean-Philippe and I felt that was a point worth making in this case, is not that we think exclusion is a new phenomenon. It's been pervasive and across time and space for all human history. Practices have exclusionary effects built in. This is irreducible, right? In my view, this is the way the world goes round. The reason why we felt we had to emphasize this is that these practices are legitimated in the policy world and narrated in the academic world as inclusive practices. And they are, to be honest. I don't know if that's because I come from North America, but most people are like, oh, that's great. More participation and the multi-stakeholders partnership, it's flatter and it's more democratic and it's more open and all of that. The same way that multilateralism is narrated in the academic literature as something positive. And that's the point of the book I wrote, was to say, well, the evidence doesn't suggest that multilateralism is necessarily equalizing. Frankly, it's not. It provides a bunch of opportunities for more stratification, right? And so I guess that's the reason why I emphasize it. It's not that I think it's surprising, or that it's only there. It's the fact that I feel like there are certain types of practices that we get carried away with, and that's probably problematic. And the last question was whether global governance is always late and a product of the liberal consensus, whether this is being challenged. And of course it's being challenged. Okay, I'm gonna, because I'm gonna sound more optimist than I am, because I don't think I'm that optimistic in general. But of course it's being challenged right now in the current crisis of I don't want to call them populist because it's a complex concept, but a clear rise of several regimes political regimes, governments that contest multilateralism and global governance. Trump said it, these words, I'm against global governance. I couldn't believe it that even he knew the concept, but anyway, he said, I'm against global governance. So you can see that a lot, but what I see there are two things. Okay, so first of all, is it that big of a different challenge than Bush Jr.? I'm not fully convinced personally. We all thought it was the end of multilateralism as well when he got elected. So in a way it is, in part also because there are other regimes now that were not necessarily there. And then the other point I want to make, and that's again something that Jean-Philippe and I have published a little bit about, is that this the influence of this liberal consensus that you talked about, rightly so in my view, has been historically quite detached from political liberalism at the domestic level, okay? What we think is happening in global governance is this consensus has become, we call it the struggle over universal values. Liberalisms and its values, right? Of democracy, human rights, and all the avatars of it in human language, human security, and sustainable development. These are all heralded sort of polysemous compromises, right? So notions that mean many things to many different people that are legitimated in terms of this liberal consensus, but that become sort of self-referential in the global governance dialect. And whether they really need liberal regimes to sustain themselves, in my view, is invalidated by the fact that a lot of the actors on the global stage that speak that liberal language are not at all liberal regimes, right? And so it's almost become, the language has taken a life of its own, and it's almost like an entry ticket to global governance. If you don't speak that language, if you don't frame your position in terms of these universal values, good luck. You know, it's impossible to name global governance to say, well, we want this because we think it's in our national interest. Nobody says that anymore, right? If you look at Security Council debates in the 40s and 50s, that was the main argument, right? Really. And so that kind of language has completely disappeared. Not because everybody's become liberal over the past 70 years, right? You know, not at all. And so I think that there's a way in which, and we wanted to study that a little bit more, perhaps we'll do it, where this liberal consensus is a bit shallow, frankly. Well, we all knew that, but it's still efficient globally, right? It still helps to legitimize certain viewpoints over others and certain policies. But I don't think it rests on domestic foundations all that much. And so the fact that we have anti-liberal regimes or illiberal regimes isn't necessarily, at least as of now, a direct threat in my view.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que vamos a cerrar aquí porque ya fueron como muchas intervenciones. Entonces quiero agradecerles mucho por su presencia hoy y por su participación en el debate y les deseo pues buenas noches, ¿no? Muchas gracias.